When a neighbor claims my private beach as her own, I face a storm of screams, lies, and legal threats, but a locked gate and cold hard proof are about to end her reign of chaos for good. Are you deaf or just stupid? Karen's shrill voice cut through the salty morning air as if the gulls themselves had gone silent to listen, her finger jabbing the sky like a sword of righteousness while every sunbather, jogger, and dog walker turned to watch. I had barely set my chair down and opened my coffee thermos before she stormed up, sandals slapping against the boardwalk, a cheap visor crooked on her head, her rage burning hotter than the rising sun. My first instinct was to laugh because it felt like an absurd prank. But when she pointed straight at me and screeched, "Get off my beach, trespasser, or I'm calling the cops," I knew this was no joke. The tension snapped the calm morning in two as nearby families froze mid-bite over their picnic muffins. A jogger tripped on his laces trying to watch, and even a kid with a kite stopped mid-run, the string slack in his hand. My hands tightened around my coffee cup, not from fear, but disbelief, because this patch of sand she claimed as hers was in fact mine. I had bought it legally, a private slice of shoreline attached to my home, papers signed, fees paid, and even the HOA reluctantly acknowledging my right to use it. Yet here she was, a woman who lived 2 streets inland, screaming like a banshee about her imaginary empire of sand. She pulled out her phone with a dramatic flair, thumb poised over 911 like she was saving humanity from a sea monster. And the murmurs of the small crowd swelled as everyone sensed a showdown brewing. I leaned back in my chair, let the waves crash behind me and said just loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "You really want to call the police on the guy who owns the beach? Go ahead, Karen. I'll wait." Gasps rippled through the crowd like a rogue wave, and the morning, once ordinary, transformed into a tense, ridiculous theater no one dared look away from. The rest of the morning unraveled like a badly written soap opera with real consequences, Karen pacing in front of me while spitting threats about HOA rules, environmental protections, and her decades-long community stewardship, none of which had anything to do with actual property right. She tried to rally support from the beachgoers, gesturing toward me as if I was a villain plotting to drain the ocean. Yet, every time I quietly sipped my coffee and smiled, her frustration grew more unhinged. A few people laughed under their breath, and one guy even whispered, "Bet she doesn't even live here," which made Karen whirl on him with a glare that could kill weeds. The cops did show up eventually, not because Karen's claim was valid, but because she screeched at dispatch that a violent squatter was endangering children by daring to sit on her sand. And when the officers arrived, the look on their faces mirrored mine, a mix of irritation and disbelief. I produced my land deed from my bag, laminated and tucked neatly behind my ID, because I had learned from past HOA nonsense to keep my receipts. And as they read the document, Karen's righteous fury turned into sputtering excuses about unwritten rules and community traditions. The officers shrugged, told her to calm down, and drove off, leaving her fuming and me, sitting like a king on his rightful throne of sand, the morning sun blazing in victorious silence. But in that moment, even as she stomped away, muttering threats about getting the HOA board involved, I knew this was not over. Karen was not the type to accept defeat, not even when crushed under the weight of legal documents and public humiliation. She would come back louder and meaner with backup. And if there was one thing I had learned from living in this neighborhood, it was that you never underestimate a bored suburban tyrant with too much time on her hands. The next few days were eerily quiet, which was unsettling because a Karen in silence is like a volcano building pressure. Sure enough, by Thursday morning, as I was locking my gate to take a short stroll along the tide line, I noticed a flyer taped to the entrance. Community alert. Illegal beach user. Protect our shoreline. HOA emergency meeting Friday. The absurdity nearly made me choke on my coffee. Not only had Karen doubled down, but she was dragging the entire HOA into her crusade, painting me as some kind of pirate squatting on a public beach, ignoring the fact that the actual public beach was a mile north, and this strip of sand had been fenced off, deeded private property for decades. I had moved here partly because I wanted a slice of peace away from the HOA circus. Yet somehow the circus had found me anyway. That night, I prepared my own stack of documents, photos, and even drone shots showing my lot lines clear as day, ready to face whatever kangaroo court awaited me. I had a knowing suspicion this wasn't just about beach access for Karen. It was about power, about a woman who had made herself queen of every block barbecue, HOA meeting, and neighborhood Facebook group. Seeing my quiet defiance as an unforgivable act of rebellion, Friday came, and the meeting was every bit as chaotic as I imagined. Karen had gathered a small army of nodding heads who didn't understand the law, but loved drama, waving petitions, and shouting about community values. When it was my turn, I stayed calm, presented my paperwork, even projected the county map showing my property line on the HOA's rented projector. The room buzzed with confusion, some realizing Karen had overstepped, others too invested in the gossip to care about facts. And then came the twist that planted the seed for my final revenge, when one of the HOA board members, clearly tired of Karen's antics, muttered that I had every right to fence off my beach if harassment continued. That single sentence was my beacon. If Karen thought she could bully me into surrendering my rights, she had underestimated how far I was willing to go to make a point. I left that meeting smiling, already planning the gate, the bold sign with my name in large letters, the lock that would keep my beach mine forever. Karen thought she had won a battle by rallying the HOA. But all she had done was hand me the tools to win the war in spectacular, undeniable fashion. And for the first time since moving here, I felt not just determined, but excited to show this self-proclaimed queen of sand that her reign was over. The morning after the infamous HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt different, as if a storm had passed, but left the sky tinged with electricity, warning that the worst was yet to come. I woke early, opened my window to the smell of salt and seaweed, and could already sense Karen plotting her next move. The beach lay quiet beyond my property fence, the waves lapping gently as though mocking the chaos that had unfolded days before. Yet even in the serenity, I could feel her presence, hovering like a mosquito waiting to sting. My coffee barely had time to cool before my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor Dave, a decent guy who usually kept out of trouble. "Heads up," he wrote. "Karen's on Facebook saying, you're barricading public land and destroying wildlife habitats." I sighed, knowing this was only the first of many fabricated accusations that would drip feed into the HOA gossip mill until people half believed them. The most infuriating part wasn't even the lies. It was how gleefully Karen seemed to wield them, turning a private property dispute into a full-blown community witch hunt. By mid-morning, as I walked down to check my property line, I found fresh footprints near the edge of my sand, as though someone had intentionally paced there, daring me to say something. A plastic Save Our Shore sign was stuck in the dunes, a cheap dramatic prop meant to provoke. It would have been funny if it weren't so transparent, like watching a bad stage play where everyone pretends the lead actress isn't wildly overacting. Later that day, as I tried to go about my normal routine, another escalation landed on my doorstep. Literally, a letter and sign but obviously written by Karen warned me that if I continued to hog the beach, she would file a community injunction and mobilize legal channels. The wording made no legal sense, but dripped with manufactured authority, every sentence screaming desperation. I crumpled it and tossed it aside, but a thought nagged at me. Karen wasn't just being annoying anymore. She was testing boundaries, pushing to see how far she could go before I snapped. That's when the first real confrontation happened after the 911 fiasco. I was installing a small storage box for beach gear near my fence when Karen marched up the path with two accomplices, women I'd seen before, hanging around her yard like courtiers around a monarch. She came in swinging with accusations, shouting about my illegal expansion, how I was blocking traditional pathways, and her friends chimed in with dramatic gasps, clutching their phones like they were about to live stream the whole ordeal. This time, I didn't just let her shout. I stood tall, wiped my hands on my jeans, and told her flatly, "You step 1 foot past this fence, and you're trespassing. Call whoever you want, Karen. But next time you make a false report, I'll be the one filing charges." The shift in her face was priceless. A flicker of uncertainty, a hairline crack in the facade of self-appointed authority. She blustered, threatened, then stormed off, muttering about bringing real power next time, whatever that meant. Watching her retreat, I realized that for Karen, this wasn't about right or wrong. It was a game of dominance, and the only way to win was to outmaneuver her publicly, undeniably, in a way that stripped her of every ounce of imagined control. That night, the plan began forming. I sat at my kitchen table with property maps spread out, legal documents highlighted, and a notepad where I scribbled ideas for a gate that wasn't just functional, but symbolic. If Karen thought this was her beach, then I would make it clear to every passerby who truly owned it, a sturdy locked entrance, a bold sign with my name, and maybe even cameras to catch her in the act next time she tried trespassing. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like poetic justice, not revenge for the sake of spite, but a necessary line in the sand, both literally and metaphorically. The next day, I called a local contractor, explained what I needed, and scheduled a consultation. The man chuckled knowingly when I hinted at the reason, telling me this wasn't the first time a self-proclaimed community watchdog had tried to muscle private landowners. It gave me a strange sense of solidarity, as if I wasn't just standing up to Karen for myself, but for every neighbor she had ever bullied. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't slowing down. Flyers appeared on car windshields in the neighborhood, claiming I was planning to build a private resort that would destroy public access forever. A particularly absurd rumor even suggested I was selling beach passes for profit, which made no sense, but spread like wildfire because people love a villain. I could have confronted her again, but I decided to let the rumors burn themselves out, knowing the truth would hit harder when I unveiled my locked gate. Still, it was exhausting to see my name dragged through mud simply because someone couldn't handle not being in control. The HOA tried to stay neutral, though I caught whispers that several board members were quietly fed up with Karen's theatrics, tired of being dragged into baseless crusade. One even left me a voicemail saying, "For what it's worth, we know you're in the right. Just make sure you do everything by the book." That small show of support fueled my resolve. If Karen thought the community would rally behind her forever, she was in for a rude awakening. By the weekend, my patience was thin, but my determination was steel. I spent hours researching fencing regulations, signage laws, and security rights for private beachfront owners. Every loophole Karen might try to exploit, I was ready to close before she could wedge it open. I pictured her face when she arrived one morning to find a locked gate with a legal notice attached. Every word backed by city ordinances and property deeds. I pictured the crowd of nosy onlookers from the first confrontation, watching as her power slipped through her fingers, and I promised myself I'd make that moment real. As the sun set over my quiet stretch of sand, painting the horizon gold, I knew this wasn't just about keeping Karen off my beach. This was about reclaiming peace, about making sure no self-appointed queen of suburbia could ever trample over me again. And as the waves whispered against the shore, I couldn't help but smile, knowing the war Karen thought she was winning was about to take a turn she could never have predicted. By Monday morning, the neighborhood buzzed with a tense energy that clung to the salt air like a storm front waiting to break. And I could tell Karen had spent the entire weekend scheming because the first thing I saw when I stepped outside was a crudely painted sign staked into the grass near the shared pathway that led to my beach entrance reading, "Say no to beach theft, community property for all." The kind of melodramatic, misleading slogan only Karen could dream up. It was almost laughable how far she was willing to go to feed her delusion. Yet under the humor, there was a real threat because the more noise she made, the more likely someone would believe her, and lies repeated loudly enough can sometimes drown out the truth. I knew I had to push forward with my plan before her antics gained more traction. That morning, a contractor named Ben arrived to survey the site for the gate. He was a big sunburned guy with a friendly grin and a no-nonsense attitude. The kind of man who had seen more neighbor disputes than he cared to count. As we walked the property line, he shook his head, muttering that people like Karen were the reason he always carried extra copies of permits for every job. He measured twice, sketched the frame, and promised me a sturdy lockable gate with a signboard large enough to be seen from the path. As we discussed design options, Karen herself appeared as if summoned by the sound of potential defeat. She marched down the pathway, phone in hand, recording us like she was documenting a crime scene, yelling about illegal construction and environmental violations. Ben didn't even blink, calmly informing her he was a licensed contractor working on privately owned land. But that only made her angrier. She called me a land thief in front of him, accused me of fencing off ancestral community grounds, and shouted that the whole neighborhood would rally against me. I didn't bother responding because I knew anything I said would fuel her fire. So, I just let her rant while Ben worked, scribbling notes and marking posts until finally she stormed away, promising to shut this down legally. As soon as she was gone, Ben gave me a knowing look and said, "Better make that lock a heavy-duty one." The harassment didn't stop there. Over the next 2 days, I caught Karen prowling around at odd hours. Phone flashlight cutting through the darkness as she tried to photograph my property lines, presumably to twist reality into something she could post online. Once I saw her crouch near my fence with a tape measure, muttering to herself about public easements, as if sheer willpower could redraw boundaries. She left another letter in my mailbox. This one threatening to contact environmental agencies about sand erosion caused by unauthorized fencing, which was absurd considering the gate hadn't even been installed yet. It became clear that Karen's crusade wasn't about community or beach access. It was about winning, about bending everyone else to her will, no matter how irrational her argument was. Watching her unravel was both frustrating and strangely revealing because underneath all that faux authority was just a desperate need for control, and I wasn't going to give it to her. By midweek, Ben returned with the first set of materials, and I took the opportunity to make sure every permit, every county approval, every legal document was in order. The city clerk, used to disputes like this, assured me my rights were ironclad, and even suggested filing a harassment complaint if Karen persisted. That idea lodged in my mind like a seed, something I could pull out later if needed. But for now, my focus was on building my defenses. As the posts went into the sand, Karen reappeared with reinforcements. This time dragging along a middle-aged man she introduced as her cousin, a legal expert. Though, judging by his bewildered expression, he was either clueless or deeply regretting agreeing to come. She launched into another tirade about how I couldn't just wall off nature, gesturing dramatically toward the horizon as if I was trying to gate the entire ocean. Ben ignored her completely while I calmly repeated the same line. This is private property, legally purchased, fully documented, and no amount of shouting changes that. Eventually, she stomped away again, dragging her legal expert behind her, but not before threatening to have the county sheriff and environmental lawyers knocking on my door. That night, my patience cracked a little. I sat on my porch, listening to the waves crash against the shore, wondering how one person could muster so much audacity and not a shred of self-awareness. Every interaction with Karen was like stepping into a warped theater where facts didn't matter, only volume and spectacle. And I realized that letting her run wild publicly made her feel untouchable. My gate would stop her physically, but to truly shut her down, I needed to dismantle her imagined authority in front of everyone. The idea started small, just a thought of holding my ground calmly. But as the hours passed, it evolved into a full vision. The day the gate was completed, I would invite the HOA board, the neighbors, maybe even those who had seen the first 911 fiasco, and I would unveil my locked entrance with the deed posted in plain sight, my name boldly marked on the sign for all to see. There would be no shouting match, no rumor left to twist, just undeniable, silent proof that Karen had been wrong all along. The next morning, a new drama unfolded. As Ben worked, Karen arrived with a pair of HOA members in tow trying to rally official support. But instead of siding with her, they mostly looked embarrassed as she yelled about illegal privatization and community betrayal. I calmly handed them copies of my deed and permits. One of them, a gray-haired woman who had seen more neighborhood squabbles than she cared to admit, gave Karen a sharp look and said, "Karen, it's his land. We can't force him to leave his own beach." Watching Karen's face twist in silent rage as even her supposed allies began to doubt her was the first taste of victory I had had since this nightmare started. She turned on her heel and stormed off, shouting that this wasn't over. But something in her stride looked less certain than before. By the end of the week, the post stood firm, the frame of the gate solid and immovable, and I could see the finish line of this absurd battle coming into view. But the tension hadn't dissipated. If anything, it had condensed, waiting to explode in one last desperate attempt from Karen to reclaim control. Every evening, I caught glimpses of her pacing near the path. Phone glued to her ear, whispering plans I couldn't quite hear. The beach was mine legally. The structure was going up unchallenged. But Karen wasn't the type to retreat quietly. Something told me her next move would be bigger, louder, maybe even riskier. And as much as I wanted peace, I was ready for it. Because when the final confrontation came, I wasn't just going to win quietly. I was going to make sure no one in this neighborhood ever doubted again who truly owned this stretch of sand. By the time the fourth week rolled around, the gate was halfway complete, its steel frame already a silent promise that my patience had limits, and I could feel Karen's desperation mounting like a rising tide before a storm. She had spent the past few days launching a last-ditch smear campaign that made the earlier rumors seem tame. Posts appeared on every local neighborhood forum accusing me of bribing the HOA, destroying marine habitats, and even smuggling construction materials illegally. A few gullible souls seemed to believe her, but most were starting to grow tired of the endless drama, whispering jokes about Queen Karen and her imaginary kingdom when they thought she couldn't hear. Yet, for every ounce of ridicule, Karen doubled down, prowling the beach path daily like a general inspecting a battlefield. She was determined not to lose. On Monday morning, as Ben and his crew hammered posts into place, Karen arrived in full theatrical glory with a new tactic. She dragged a local reporter from a small community news outlet, probably hoping to turn my private property dispute into a scandal that would shame me into surrender. She posed for photos in front of my unfinished gate, hands on hips, accusing me of stealing public land, loudly proclaiming that the community's way of life is under attack. When the reporter, a young woman with an increasingly skeptical expression, asked to see proof of her claims, Karen stuttered, changed the subject, and pointed at me as though sheer volume could substitute for evidence. I calmly walked over, handed the reporter my deed, showed her the county map on my tablet, and watched her eyebrows rise as the truth unraveled Karen's fairy tale. By the time the reporter left, visibly unimpressed by Karen's theatrics, my neighbors' kids were giggling from their porch, whispering that Karen had just made herself look ridiculous in front of the entire block. But embarrassment only seemed to fuel her madness. The very next day, I woke to find spray-painted slogans on my fence reading, "Stop beach thief and community property forever." It was sloppy and desperate, the kind of move that reeked of someone losing control. And though I had no direct proof, everyone knew who was behind it. I called the police, filed a vandalism report, and Karen spent the morning pacing outside, loudly declaring that I had framed her to silence her activism. The officers didn't buy it. They simply reminded me to install cameras, which I had already planned to do. The neighborhood, once just a quiet cluster of houses by the water, had turned into a small-scale war zone of pettiness and escalating antics, all because one woman couldn't accept that my land wasn't hers to command. Even Dave, my usually laid-back neighbor, came over one evening shaking his head, telling me that Karen had tried to recruit him to testify that he'd seen me block public access, which he refused because he knew it was a blatant lie. The more she grasped for allies, the more she exposed her true nature, and I realized that she wasn't just losing this battle legally, she was losing it socially, her reputation crumbling under the weight of her own arrogance. The next big explosion came midweek when Karen marched up with a clipboard and a handful of signatures, demanding a community vote to force me to tear down the gate. She gathered a small crowd of her loyal followers, the same few faces who clung to her drama like moths to a flame, and tried to stage a public confrontation. I let her rant for a while, let her claim that democracy was on her side before I calmly reminded everyone that no neighborhood vote could override legal property right. I held up my documents once again, clearly outlining my ownership, and even read aloud a section of county law that backed me up. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Karen sputtered, clearly unprepared to be confronted with actual facts. Finally, one of her supposed supporters asked her point blank why she was fighting so hard for access to a private beach when a public beach was just a mile away. The look on her face was priceless, an exposed fraud with no script to fall back on. She muttered something about principle and stormed off, leaving behind a trail of eye rolls and muttered laughter. Behind the scenes, I was pushing forward with my plan to end this feud once and for all. The gate installation was on track to finish by the weekend, and I had commissioned a custom sign with bold black lettering that read, "Private property owned by my name. Trespassers will be prosecuted." It wasn't just a warning. It was a statement carved into steel that no amount of yelling or rumoring could erase. I also installed 2 security cameras facing the path. Not just for protection, but to capture the inevitable moment when Karen tried to defy the locked gate. It wasn't malice driving me anymore, but necessity. I had to make this fight so undeniably one-sided that Karen would have no room left to twist the story. Late one night, as I double-checked the camera feeds and paperwork, I thought back to that first ridiculous confrontation where she called 911 on me for daring to sit on my own sand. And I felt a mix of disbelief and amusement that her stubbornness had dragged this nonsense so far. But I also felt a growing satisfaction knowing that the end was coming, and this time it would be her turn to face public humiliation she couldn't spin or escape from. On Friday afternoon, Karen tried one last desperate ploy. She stood outside my gate in progress, filming herself for what I assumed was a social media rant, claiming she was witnessing the illegal fortification of public land, as if she were exposing a government conspiracy. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, not bothering to engage because the cameras were recording everything. At one point, she dramatically shook the fence post and yelled that no gate can stop justice, which earned a few snickers from passing neighbors. When Ben's crew arrived to finish the final welding, Karen was still there, shouting empty threats about bringing state-level authorities to shut me down. One of the workers, clearly fed up, muttered that she was the reason contractors charged extra for beachfront jobs. By the time the sun dipped low, the skeleton of the gate stood tall and unmovable, a silent sentinel promising that my slice of beach would finally be mine in peace. Karen lingered, staring at it like a queen watching her castle crumble. And for the first time since this feud began, I saw hesitation in her eyes. The flicker of someone realizing they were losing everything they thought they controlled. I didn't say a word as she retreated. Phone still recording, but her steps slower, heavier. I just stood there, imagining the day soon to come when the lock clicked shut, the sign gleamed in the sunlight, and every ounce of her false power washed away with the tide, leaving me with the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. Saturday morning arrived heavy with anticipation, the kind that clings to your skin like mist before a storm breaks, because today was the day the gate would be finished, and the war that Karen had waged for weeks would finally tilt in my favor for good. I woke early, brewed my coffee, and stared out at the unfinished frame standing tall at the edge of my property, a silent promise of the boundary that would end the chaos she had dragged me through. I half expected Karen to make some kind of preemptive strike, but the street outside was unusually quiet, as though even she knew this was her last chance and was gathering strength for a final spectacle. Ben and his crew arrived just after sunrise, unloading the heavy steel panels and a gleaming padlock that looked sturdy enough to secure Fort Knox. As they worked, the sound of drills and hammers echoed across the neighborhood, a metallic drum beat announcing the end of free reign on my beach. Sure enough, just before noon, Karen appeared like a storm cloud on the horizon, striding down the path with her usual entourage of self-proclaimed witnesses, cameras ready, and a new level of theatrical rage simmering under her forced smile. She shouted accusations before even reaching the gate, calling me a land thief, a tyrant, claiming that this was an affront to the entire community, and her friends dutifully filmed every word, as if capturing evidence of a historic injustice. But unlike the first time she ambushed me, there was no tremor of uncertainty in my stance now. Every piece of paperwork, every permit, every county ordinance was lined up in my favor, and today there would be no yelling match. Just quiet, undeniable proof that her reign of delusion had ended. As Ben tightened the final bolts, Karen tried to push past him, shrieking that she had the right to inspect public land. And when he firmly blocked her path, she launched into another empty threat about calling the police. I couldn't help but chuckle because this time it wouldn't be me defending myself, it would be her. I calmly reminded her in front of everyone watching that the last time she called the cops on me, it had blown up in her face. And if she tried again today, I would happily show them the security footage of her trespassing and vandalizing my fence earlier in the week. That earned a few gasps and murmurs from the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch, their curiosity outweighing their fear of getting caught in Karen's web of drama. For once, the tide of public opinion wasn't flowing in her favor. People were whispering about how far she had gone, how ridiculous it was to fight over private land when the public beach was right down the road. And Karen, sensing her support slipping, turned up the theatrics to a whole new level. She threw herself against the unfinished gate, sobbing about losing a childhood treasure. A performance so over the top that even her own friends exchanged awkward glances. It might have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic, watching someone so desperate for control crumble under the weight of truth they couldn't escape from anymore. By late afternoon, the final panel slid into place with a solid metallic clang that seemed to echo like a gavel striking down judgment. The gate stood tall and unmovable, crowned by the custom steel sign I had commissioned. Private property owned by my name, a no trespassing. The bold black letters glinted in the sun, visible from the path long before anyone reached the entrance, a clear, indisputable marker that the beach beyond belonged to me and only me. Ben handed me the hefty padlock, and I felt a strange calm settle over me as I clicked it shut for the first time. The sound was definitive, a lock not just on the gate, but on weeks of harassment, false accusations, and public humiliation Karen had dragged me through. She screamed something incoherent about illegal fortresses, and justice will prevail. But her words sounded hollow now, bouncing off steel and indifference. The crowd didn't cheer, but they didn't rally to her either. They simply drifted away, some shaking their heads, others smirking at the spectacle, leaving Karen standing alone in the sand path, sputtering threats that no one believed anymore. I should have felt nothing but victory, but a part of me still burned with anger at how far this had gone. Owning property shouldn't have meant fighting tooth and nail against a self-appointed tyrant desperate for relevance. And yet here I was, weeks of my life stolen by her obsessive need to control what was never hers. I watched her retreat slowly, glancing back at the gate as if it was a personal betrayal, and I knew this wasn't the end of her tantrums, but it was the end of her power. The cameras I had installed would ensure that every future attempt to trespass or vandalize would come with consequences, and the gate, legally backed and physically unbreakable, would keep her delusions in check. For the first time since that absurd morning, when she screamed at me for sitting in my own chair on my own sand, I felt something close to peace washing over me with the tide. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in streaks of orange and pink, I dragged a chair to my side of the locked gate, poured myself a cold drink, and simply sat there, savoring the silence. No shouts, no false alarms, no audience waiting for a spectacle. Just me, the waves, and the knowledge that my patience and persistence had outlasted Karen's chaos. Dave wandered over later, laughing that the whole neighborhood had been buzzing about the great beach battle finally ending, and even offered to host a barbecue in my honor for surviving the ordeal. We shared a quiet moment of triumph, knowing the message had been sent loud and clear. This wasn't Karen's kingdom, and her imaginary crown had been washed away forever. But as night fell, I caught a glimpse of her standing at the far end of the path, watching the locked gate in silence. Her silhouette stiff, motionless, like a dethroned ruler staring at the palace she thought was hers. There was no yelling this time, no performance for an audience, just a quiet, simmering disbelief that she had truly lost. For a fleeting second, I almost felt pity for her, clinging so desperately to a fantasy of power that never existed, almost. But then I remembered every lie, every threat, every stolen moment of peace, and that pity dissolved like foam on the tide. This battle was done. The beach was mine, and no amount of scheming would ever change that again. The next week unfolded like a strange calm after a hurricane, the neighborhood quieter than it had been in months. Yet beneath that calm, I could sense an uneasy tension, as if Karen's defeat had left a void she couldn't bear to accept. The locked gate stood firm at the end of my property, the sign gleaming in the morning sun, and for the first few days, no one dared challenge it. Neighbors passed by on their walks and threw me supportive nods or quick comments about how glad they were that the drama seemed over. Even the HOA, usually eager to meddle, stayed silent, perhaps relieved that one of their most troublesome members had finally been put in her place. But I knew Karen too well by now to believe she would surrender quietly. She wasn't just nursing her wounded pride. She was plotting, stewing, trying to claw back a shred of control in a battle she had lost publicly and irreversibly. I spent those early days double-checking my security cameras, keeping my paperwork close, and waiting for the inevitable moment she tried something desperate. Sure enough, on Thursday evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in fire-orange streaks, I caught her on camera approaching the gate with a flashlight and a pair of bolt cutters, muttering curses under her breath like a woman possessed. I didn't rush out to confront her. I let the cameras record every second as she pulled, yanked, and even kicked the steel barrier that refused to yield. When she finally noticed the red blinking light of the camera above her head, she froze, eyes wide, with the realization that her tantrum was on tape. She bolted up the path like a spooked animal, leaving behind nothing but footprints and the echo of her failure. The next morning, I filed a report with the police, turning over the footage, and an officer paid her a visit that left the entire street buzzing. No charges yet, just a warning. But the sight of a squad car in front of Karen's house felt like justice slowly tightening its grip. Despite her humiliations, Karen couldn't stay away from the beach she claimed as her own kingdom. The following day she lingered near the path almost daily, glaring at the locked gate as if she could will it to disappear. Sometimes she muttered to herself. Sometimes she loudly told anyone who would listen that a legal battle was coming, though by now most neighbors just shrugged or walked on, having grown tired of her theatrics. Dave told me over beers one evening that Karen had tried again to rally people on the community Facebook group, claiming I was planning to expand the fence and steal even more land, but the comments section had turned on her, filled with people telling her to move on and stop embarrassing the neighborhood. The social power she once wielded like a club was crumbling, replaced by ridicule and eye rolls, and I could see it eating away at her every time she glanced toward my property and saw the barrier she couldn't touch. The tide of public opinion, once her greatest weapon, had fully turned against her, and she was left alone with her obsession. But Karen wasn't the kind of person who let logic or shame stop her. On Saturday, just after sunrise, I woke to the sound of shouting outside. I opened my door to find her standing at the locked gate with a hastily made protest sign reading, "No private beaches," and a megaphone blaring nonsense about community rights and unjust tyranny. A handful of curious onlookers gathered, some sipping coffee and watching like it was free entertainment. I walked down, calm and deliberate, holding my deed and a printed copy of the state's private property laws. And when she tried to shout over me, I simply raised my voice enough for everyone to hear the truth. I explained clearly step by step that the land was privately purchased, legally documented, and that no law granted her access. I pointed out the cameras recording everything, the police report already filed, and the fact that repeated trespass attempts could land her in real legal trouble. For once, Karen seemed to falter, her words stumbling as the crowd listened in stony silence. A neighbor finally cut in, saying what everyone was thinking. "Karen, just stop. You lost. Let it go." The small group dispersed soon after, leaving Karen standing red-faced and fuming, her megaphone dangling uselessly at her side. I didn't have to say another word. The image of her defeat, witnessed by everyone, spoke louder than anything I could have shouted. Later that day, I sat on my porch watching the waves roll in and thought about how absurdly far this battle had gone. What started as a ridiculous confrontation had spiraled into weeks of harassment, lies, vandalism, and even attempted break-ins. All because one person couldn't accept boundaries that weren't hers to set. The gate had become more than just a physical barrier. It was a line in the sand against bullying, a silent statement that no one, no matter how loud or manipulative, could strip away what was rightfully mine. As I watched the sunset, I felt the kind of deep satisfaction that only comes after a long fight won not by brute force, but by patience, persistence, and refusing to stoop to the level of someone who thrives on chaos. But the story wasn't done yet. That evening, Dave came by to tell me Karen had been ranting about filing a lawsuit, claiming she would take this to the highest court in the state. We both laughed at the thought, knowing she had no legal footing. But I also knew Karen's pride was a beast that wouldn't die easily. She needed the illusion of control to survive. And every day that locked gate stood was a reminder that her reign of imagined power was over. Still, unlike before, I no longer felt anxious about her next move. The cameras, the legal documents, the police report, and the unshakable support of my neighbors had turned the tide completely in my favor. Whatever stunt Karen tried next would only dig her hole deeper, and she had no one left to drag down with her. As night fell and the waves whispered softly against the shore, I realized I had finally reclaimed more than just my beach. I had reclaimed my peace, my right to enjoy my home without fear of harassment, and my certainty that bullies only win when you let them. The battle had been long, absurd, and exhausting, but it had forged a line Karen could never cross again, a locked gate standing as proof that her false kingdom was nothing more than sand washed away by the tide of truth. Sunday dawned quiet and golden, the kind of morning that made living by the ocean feel like a privilege rather than a battleground. Yet I woke with the distinct sense that something final was brewing in the air. After weeks of chaos, false accusations, desperate protests, and even midnight sabotage attempts, Karen had grown silent for 2 full days, which anyone who knew her understood wasn't surrender, but planning. I sipped my coffee on the porch, the locked gate standing proudly at the end of my property like a monument to perseverance, and I wondered how she would try to claw back the power she had lost in front of the entire neighborhood. By mid-morning, the answer arrived in the form of a spectacle only Karen could dream up. A caravan of cars pulled up near the beach path, and outspilled not just Karen, but a handful of people she had clearly roped into one last grand attempt to overthrow reality. They carried hastily painted protest signs, a cheap megaphone, and even a drone someone had probably borrowed to get aerial footage of what she still insisted on calling stolen community land. She had turned her obsession into a pathetic rally, a final desperate bid to reclaim an empire that had never been hers, and she strutted toward the locked gate with her chin high, shouting that today justice would be restored. Neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion, forming a loose circle around the scene. Dave appeared at my side with his phone ready, whispering that this was going to be good. I walked down the path slowly, not rushing, not shouting, simply holding the folder that had become my shield through this entire ordeal. The deed, the permits, and the police report from her last stunt. Karen was in full performance mode, declaring to anyone who would listen that the gate was illegal, that I had conspired with corrupt officials to steal sacred beach access, that the whole neighborhood had been betrayed. Her words bounced hollowly off the metal gate and the skeptical stares of the crowd. When she saw me, she pointed dramatically and shouted that today the people would tear down the fence and take back what was theirs. She reached for the gate as though she expected everyone to follow, to storm it like some medieval siege, but not a single person moved. Instead, all eyes turned to me, waiting, curious to see how this long, ridiculous war would finally end. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply unlocked the folder, pulled out the large laminated deed, and held it up for all to see. My name printed in bold alongside the official county seals. I then showed the letter from the HOA confirming my rights and the police report documenting Karen's repeated harassment and trespass attempts. I spoke calmly, clearly making sure every word reached the crowd, explaining once again that this beach was private property, legally purchased, protected by law, and that no rumor or protest could change that fact. I reminded everyone of the public beach less than a mile away, free and open to all, and asked why someone would choose to wage war over what they could never own. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of waves crashing in the distance. Karen's face flushed crimson, her mouth opening and closing without finding words. The audience that once might have rallied behind her stood still, no longer enchanted by her noise, only embarrassed to have been dragged into weeks of pointless conflict. And then came the final twist, the one she could never have seen coming. From the path behind the crowd, 2 uniformed police officers approached, having been called earlier when Karen announced her beach reclamation rally on social media. They had watched enough of the scene to know exactly what was happening. One officer approached me, confirmed my name, then glanced over my documents with a nod before turning to Karen. Calmly but firmly, they warned her that this was her final notice. Any further harassment, trespass, or attempts to damage my property would result in charges for harassment and attempted destruction of private property. The words hit like a thunderclap, not just for Karen, but for everyone watching. The weight of authorities slamming down on weeks of unchecked nonsense. Karen tried to protest, waving her arms wildly, crying about injustice and conspiracies, but the officers weren't interested in her theatrics. They told her plainly to leave, to take her crowd and her drone and her signs, and to never set foot on my property again. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring, shaking their heads, their patience for her crusade long gone. And just like that, Karen, who had once strutted around like the queen of the neighborhood, was left standing alone before the locked gate, powerless and humiliated in a way no rumor could undo. As the officers walked her back to her car, she cast one last venomous look over her shoulder, a silent promise that she wouldn't forget this defeat. But there was no fire left in her. The battle she had started so loudly had ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, crushing truth no tantrum could erase. When the last car drove away, and the beach path fell silent again, I turned to Dave, who raised his drink in a mock toast and said, "Long live the king of the beach." We both laughed, not because the fight had been funny. It had been exhausting, absurd, and maddening, but because in the end common sense and persistence had triumphed over chaos. That evening I unlocked the gate and walked down to the sand alone, the ocean stretching vast and peaceful under a fading sky streaked with gold and lavender. The weight that had pressed on my chest for weeks finally lifted, replaced by a deep, satisfying calm. Every step I took on that sand felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen. Not just property, but peace of mind, the right to enjoy what I had worked for without fear of harassment. I dragged my chair to the water's edge, sat with my feet buried in the cool sand, and watched the sun sink below the horizon as the tide whispered its eternal rhythm. Behind me, the locked gate stood like a silent sentinel, my name gleaming on the sign, a boundary no one could cross again. The neighborhood had seen the truth with their own eyes. The law had spoken, and Karen's false kingdom had finally crumbled into dust. For the first time since moving here, the beach was truly mine, not just by deed and law, but in spirit, a sanctuary free from noise and nonsense. And as the waves rolled in under the first stars of the night, I promised myself that never again would anyone, no matter how loud or entitled, dictate where I could stand on my own sand.